Off to bed.
That's it. What is this working? What?
Can you hear me? Okay.
Okay. Good. Thank you. Jenny knows a lot of interesting people. We'll get into that later. She's as interesting as any of them.
Oh, thank you.
She started as a model, got involved in the whole swinging London scene, wound up with a PhD in psychology or something like that, and has written 3 books, 2 collections of interviews, and 1 memoir. So we got a lot of directions to talk about. This book, the current one, is interviews with just any number of people, most of whom you will have heard of, some of whom I haven't heard of, and I know a lot of people. Some I know of, and I'm saying, what the hell is Hank Marvin doing in this book? I mean, because he's pretty obscure in the United States. So it's all sorts of interesting people. If you don't know who they are, you will by the time you finish the book. And so we will launch right into Jenny. It isn't just a collection of interviews. It's a collection of interviews with a common sort of a thread. And could you tell us what that is?
I will. How this book started was when we moved to Los Angeles, and after some time, I decided I wanted to go to, after all the crazy kind of rock and roll kind of days, I decided that it was time, age 37, that I went to college. I'd never been to college before, and I got my bachelor's and master in counseling psychology, and then I thought, well, the thing I really love to do is to write. So I decided I would go for the PhD because I knew I would have to write and I'd have to finish it within a certain amount of time. So thinking what I could write about, the one thing I did know is that I'd been with musicians and around musicians and famous musicians and all different kinds since the age of about 16, 17, starting off with my sister Patty, being in the Beatles film and then ending up marrying George Harrison and then later Eric Clapton. And I was married to Mick Fleetwood, who we knew each other when we were 16, and was very much involved when Peter Green was in the band, and so I knew about musicians. But what was most important to me was I never felt creative. Even though I loved writing, I wrote poems, I did all these things, I never felt creative. So I decided I wanted to write a book about creativity, and the best people to ask about this would be the musicians that I'd known. And hopefully I would find more. Well, that was pretty easy. Then my second husband was going on the road with Bonnie Raitt, Crosby, Stills and Nash, Jackson Browne, and other musicians, Don Henley. And so I had a lot to choose from, all of Fleetwood Mac, George Harrison, Eric Clapton. And so there was a lot to choose from. So I got a lot of questions I wanted to ask, and started with Don Henley. And I was able to ask one of the questions that I thought you should never ask a musician or any artist, like, where does the muse come from? But I asked them this question, have you ever experienced a peak experience? Which was something that psychologist Abraham Maslow termed for when you kind of come out of yourself, where there's where words come from you don't know where, or lyrics come into your lap. And David Crosby had said, when they're playing with Crosby, Stills and Nash, and they really get into the zone, they all start the wrong verse at the same time. So there's a real connection. And to me, in doing these interviews was just the most wonderful thing, I think, time I've ever had, because they were so open and they answered all the questions. And so I had people like, once I'd done my dissertation and a publisher was interested, then I had the blues musicians, and Buddy Guy and B.B. King, and then I had Ravi Shankar. But the extraordinary thing about this time was that it was as if I was on the zone, and I would just need to think of somebody I wanted to interview, and they would appear. You know, say it was Ravi Shankar, and someone would say, oh, I know he's staying in a hotel in Santa Monica. And it was like that. It was almost as if this had to be done. This had to be written. Mm.
You started pretty much with people you knew personally.
Mm-hmm.
A couple of whom you were married to at one point or another.
Mm-hmm.
But was that easy or hard to approach even people you knew and tell them what was going on and get them to talk to you about that?
No, they were interested. Because, and the result would often be, after I'd interviewed somebody, was, I loved that interview. You know, it's not like, well, what do you normally eat for breakfast?
Yeah.
You know, it was like something that was thought-provoking, and often they would say that was just like a therapy session. And I think because I was learning to be a therapist, I knew after I'd asked a question and they gave an answer, when to keep quiet, when to just wait, rather than try and fill in the gap. So then they would go deeper, and you know, I got a lot of information that I think maybe if I'd just jumped in, I wouldn't have got.
How about people you didn't know? I mean, it's just
Like, yeah.
somebody. Oh, it would be nice to talk to such and so, and then how did you approach them? And
I would, well, often, you know, because I'd got George and I'd got all of Fleetwood Mac and the ones I had, then it was much easier to get Peter Gabriel or, you know, B.B. King or whoever else. They were wanting to be part of it.
You have a pretty wide range of people involved here. I mean, they're all involved in rock and roll or the rootsier end of it, as opposed to country music or Engelbert Humperdinck or, you know, any other way you might have gone. But were you a fan of Willie Dixon and these people?
Yeah, I loved the blues. When I was sort of 16, that's pretty much all I used to listen to. Mm. So every musician, I liked their music. But and the sort of questions I would ask them, and one of the questions I wanted to just read a little something from Christine McVie, was asking them, do they think that we all have the potential to be creative? That was interesting to me because I wanted other people to know that we can all be creative. But the thing is, what Chris says here, she says that you have to know what your thing is, because she says, if I'm a brilliant songwriter, but I'd rather be a gardener, and I'm out slogging away trying to grow orchids, I'm never going to grow our orchids very well. I should really be acknowledging my true gift. A lot of people aren't even aware what their gift is until they've reached middle age. It's all a question of interpreting our gift and knowing how to use it. And, you know, and everybody, I think, you know, Joni Mitchell said something like, you know, the net that you capture creativity is made up of the threads of your alertness. So it's about being mindful and sort of in the moment. Everybody said everybody has the potential to be creative, not necessarily in music or, you know, obvious ways, but it could be in different ways.
You went to India with the Beatles and other people, mm-hmm. and studied with Maharishi, correct?
Yeah.
And did that help you in the direction of being going into psychology and that sort of thing?
No, because, I was 19 then. And but I was at a stage in my life where I was looking for a deeper meaning to my life. And so when I was asked if I would like to go to India by George, that was like my dream come true, because I'd been in San Francisco for 6 months before that, taking LSD or smoking weed or whatever, still trying to find some awareness of some like sort of greater feeling, more than modeling or what I had been doing. I wanted sort of meaning to life, and so going to India did that. And what was so nice is being able to go with the Beatles and Patty and John's wife Cynthia. We'd meet on the top of the bungalows on the rooftops, and they would play. John and Paul and George, they would play. But what was interesting to me years later was that everything that they wrote, every song that they wrote, was about what was going on in the ashram. Even little things, like Bungalow Bill. There was a Bungalow Bill, and he went out shooting tigers. Or there was Prudence, who'd sort of lost the plot and was staring at walls, and she couldn't come out of this trance. So I went in there with a pipe and that, playing that, and that didn't do anything. So I remember John going in with his guitar and singing Dear Prudence, that just came off the top of his head. And it was so extraordinary just seeing them create. And another instance was everything they did was creative. And there was one day when I was meditating, and I thought, well, I'll try and meditate for 2 days, because we were meant to be sort of building up how long we could meditate for. And so I had meditated during the day and meditated that evening. In the middle of the night, I had this terrible headache and felt really hot and not at all well. So at one point I thought, I've got to go and find Maharishi. And middle of the night I woke him up and said I was going through this terrible, I wasn't feeling well, and I was, the room was swimming. And he said, oh, no, you just got to go back and meditate, because you're hitting an iceberg. And an iceberg was when you come out of meditation, long meditation, and something is not resolved. And so he said, you just got to go back and meditate. So I carried on and just struggled through the night, and finally went to bed. And when Patty came in to see if I wanted breakfast, she just said, you look terrible. And they called for the doctor. And when the doctor came, he said, oh, you've got tonsillitis. But I'd had my tonsils out when I was a kid. But luckily, another doctor came later on in the day and said, you've got dysentery. And so, which, India and all that. And so I sort of had to stay in bed for a while, but I had visitors. And two of the visitors was John and his wife Cynthia. And John had done a drawing for me. And it was a drawing of this Indian man who was sitting in sort of lotus position, and he had a turban on his head, and he was playing a pipe, and he had a basket. And in the basket was this snake, sort of like coming up from the basket. And he'd written underneath, by the power that's in and the power that's out, I cast your tonsil lighthouse out. Love, John, and sin. So the thing is, my point is, they were creating all the time, whether it was drawing or singing or, whatever it was. And so that was a great sort of, when I was writing the book about creativity, just remembering that stuff.
Famously, I suppose, Donovan wrote Jennifer Juniper About You, which became one of his better-known songs. Are you specifically in the song? I mean, you recognize traits and that sort of thing? No, well, it's your name, but...
No, he had a crush on me,
like
obviously.
You were talking about Prudence, for instance.
Yeah, right. Yeah, because I was working, before we went to India, I was working in the Beatles shop in Baker Street, and Donovan came in one day, and I'd met him before, and I didn't know I was working there, and wanted to know about Maharishi and about San Francisco and all this stuff, and then invited me after a couple of dates, say, to his manager's house, and there he said he'd written a song for me. And so he got out his guitar, went and took me into this room, and started playing and singing Jennifer Juniper. So I guess I was probably about 18, and I was incredibly shy, and I just didn't know where to look. But I loved the song, and I've listened to it over the years in elevators like Muzak, or in supermarkets, and I've known people who've called their daughter Juniper, and but the thing for me is I feel it's my song, but also it brings back a time of such innocence, and that's what's so lovely about it.
When in the flyleaf of your book and in Wikipedia, it says that Mick Jagger had also written the song for you. Would you care to address that?
Yeah. That got taken out of context years ago and seems to have been sort of copied in other articles. What happened when we got back from India, my sister Patty and I had this antique market. In the antique market, we had this stall. And it was like one of those places you'd go and get your palm read or something. So I would sit in there, and we had all this Art Nouveau and Art Deco, and Patty'd go out and find the goods. And Mick Jagger kept coming in there and chatting with me. And I was very shy of him. I didn't know what to say, so I'd just show him something else we'd bought. And he'd just laugh at me and say, "Oh, I can see you're growing up." Very sort of condescending. And one time he came in and he said, sat down next to me and he said, "Well, I've written a song about you. And it's about you, but it's not." And so I think I must have said that story to someone, and then finally that becomes part of the people that have written a song about you. So that's that.
So if he did,
I never even thought to say what was it called.
Lost to history.
It didn't occur to me.
Jumping Jack Flash, perhaps.
Yeah, thanks.
It's about you, but it's not about you.
Yeah.
Was Mick Fleetwood your introduction to all of this? Because you knew him when you were both quite young, right?
Yeah, he would watch me coming back from school when I was about 16 and going to the coffee shop in Notting Hill Gate with my friends. And he lived just near there, and he was in a band called the Shanes, and they would congregate just around there. So I heard later, many years later, he'd watch me coming back from school and tell himself, "That's the girl I'm going to marry." And so, but we kind of got together when I was, we were friends, but then we got together when we were about sort of just 16, 17. But the first, I suppose, thing was that Patty was asked to, she was a model too, and she was asked to appear in Hard Day's Night. And that's where she met George. And so knowing George was the first sort of musician that I knew. And it was quite sweet because when she said, "Oh, you must come and meet him," I went to where she lived in Chelsea, not knowing what to expect. And she opened the door, and there was George. And he looked so little, it's like he was larger than life, and you just saw the Beatles were huge. But he was so lovely and just shook his hand, and it was like as if I'd known him for years because his face was familiar. And he was just one of the sweetest people I think I ever met. Mm.
That's nice. Would you care to read another excerpt from the book?
Yeah. One of the questions I asked was about drugs and alcohol. What part that played in creativity? Did it enhance or did it block it? And so Eric Clapton, what was very interesting for me and fortunate, because I've known Eric, obviously, because me and the children, Amelia and Lucy, all lived round the corner from Patty and Eric in Surrey. And it was when Eric was drinking a lot and using. And so he was like a horrible older brother. And he would often make me cry, or he'd sort of then put his arm round and be, there was no one sweeter. But he was really quite annoying. And by the time I was doing this, he and Patty weren't together anymore. And he'd actually stopped drinking and stopped using quite recently. So I went to his house that I'd been to many times before and sat down with him. And he was great. And for the first time, I could ask him questions, and deep questions. And he was brilliant. He just gave wonderful answers. And in fact, I think might be one of my favorite interviews. I'm not sure. There's some good ones here. But I did say, when you first started drinking or taking drugs, did it affect your creativity, and did it enhance or block it? So he said, to begin with, drink is very, very battling and cunning. It's actually got a personality of its own. Part of its trap is to open the doors to unreleased channels or rooms you hadn't explored before or allowed to be opened. A lot of my creative things came out first of all through marijuana. I started smoking when I was about 18 or 19, pot or hash, and that would let out a whole string of humorous things as well as music. Then drink allowed me to become very self-pitying and opened up the whole kind of sorrowful musical side of myself. Unfortunately, after that, the booze became more important than the doors it's opening. So that's the trap. I think in a lot of cases, people do have inhibitions about expressing themselves. More people are very shy and very neurotic and nervous about even meeting other people, but are fine after having a couple of drinks. And that's the same with being creative. So it goes on, different, because Eric was actually my first inspiration to writing this whole book. Because we lived around the corner from him, and I would often see him drunk, and and he was such a great player. I remember once, we'd go to his shows, and he was literally lying on the stage, still playing his guitar, completely wasted. And he was extraordinary, but I think that there was something about him that I always thought. He's an amazing musician, and yet he would always downplay it, say, no, I'm not, I'm just like anybody else. And when I was thinking about what I was going to write about, I thought, well, why does he downplay it? Why is he drinking to oblivion? And so I wondered whether the gift that he had, was it something that was just too strong for him, too powerful? Was it like staring into the face of God, or touching the hem of God's garment, and it was too much? So when I interviewed him, because he was not drinking, I was able to tell him that he was my inspiration, really. And I told him, what I thought, and he said, you're absolutely right. Sometimes it feels like you're naked, staring into the face of God. And it took a lot for him to really accept that this was a gift, and he had a responsibility to use it. So that was really good. And I think there's a bit here where he says, it's in this one. Yeah, he said, I don't know why I chose to play the blues or play rock and roll. I don't know why it settled on me in the middle of the countryside in England to be a messenger in a way. I've got no idea. I don't really like to analyze it. Maybe I've been handed something to lead on, to carry on in this generation. I often feel a very, very strong sense of responsibility towards that, as if it's something that's not really anything to do with me. So it'd be like carrying a torch. It's more powerful than I am, and I have to kind of be a servant to it. I think that's a great line. But there were so many great quotes in here. There's a wonderful jazz musician called Tony Williams, and he was talking about people who, play very fast with their guitar, or they're so clever, but actually it's not the music itself or how clever you are, how quick you are. It's about the spirit that touches people, and that's what's most important. And I have to tell I have to tell you something. That when I did these interviews, it was between 1988 and 1990, and it was the time when you had audio cassettes. And so I interviewed 75 different musicians. And so after I'd got the book out, the first book came out in 92, and it was called Musicians in Tune. After that was out, but I only used snippets of the interviews because it was under, titles like The Collective Unconscious or Drugs and Alcohol, or, so I just used little bits, and it was a lot of me. It was definitely more kind of like like a dissertation, different to this. And I think that, oh God, I've just lost my train of thought. Hang on, where was I going? Yeah, 75, the cassette tapes. And so after that, because we were living in LA, I put them in a bank vault because I didn't want anybody to steal them, because they trusted me, and some of the things that were on the tapes were not for general public. And so I looked after these audio tapes. Then I moved to England, and I took them all with me. And when I was in England, I moved around quite a few different places, and I dragged the tapes around with me, the cassette tapes, and always worried that someone might steal them or they might get lost or anything like that, till finally, and I hate to say it, but finally I couldn't stand it any longer and decided I'm going to destroy them. And so I sat down, this was after about 25 years, so I sat down and I started tearing up the tapes, and I only saved 7. And I don't know why I chose these 7. So the 7 were Don Henley, Ringo, George Harrison, Eric Clapton, Tony Williams, Ravi Shankar, Graham Nash, and Joni Mitchell, but also Don Henley. So I saved them. So their tapes, their whole interview is in this book. So you can see Joni Mitchell, what she says, in sort of at that time in life, so she was quite a bit younger. But also in here, I've got new musicians, current ones. There's a guy called Jacob Collier, who's only about 28, and he's considered, I know in England, as a genius. We've got Atticus Ross, because he does the music, him and Trent Reznor, for films. And we got a wonderful songwriter called Egg White, who did songs for sort of famous musicians, famous singers. I don't know, mostly ones that are from America. But what he did, he'd write the song, but what he told me, which I found very interesting, was that nowadays it's not how they used to write songs. You'd have somebody who'd do the lyrics, and then you send it to somebody else who does the drums, and then you send it to someone else. So there's about, 5 or 6 or 7 people involved in just one song. So it's very different. To me, it seemed sort of slightly more contrived rather than you coming out with the whole song. So that was sort of what we've got in here, which makes it different to, and because I didn't have all the tapes then, there are a lot of interviews that say it was Keith Richards in my original book, and it would be his little quotes from him under different chapters. Now you just look up Keith Richards, and you've got the whole interview, the whole thing from the original book. So that's how this book is.
How did you select the newer people? You were talking about that just now, but
much more difficult. It was so easy when I did it all those years ago, because now a lot of musicians, they have about 6 or 7 managers, and you got to really jump through the hoops. Luckily, Jacob Collier, he had 2 managers, and they were so nice, and anybody that was dealing with him was very nice, and they gave me a ticket to go and watch him play in Bristol, and so I met him, and that was easy. And of course, Atticus is part of our family,
yeah.
And somebody else told me about Egg White, and but the other person I've got in here is Peter Green, and it's not because Peter died, but I knew somebody who had written a biography about him, and I'd been interviewed for him, about him. So I asked this person who'd interviewed a lot with Peter Green before he died, and said, has he ever answered these questions? So I gave him a list of questions, and he had. So I've got Peter in here, which I really wanted, because I thought he was just one of the most amazing musicians and so talented. And it was so tragic what happened to him throughout his life.
It's because
he became a paranoid schizophrenic, and so, he wasn't Peter how we knew him, and it was just incredibly sad. Such an incredibly talented musician.
Yeah, I mean, renowned. I mean, still respected, certainly by other musicians.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody who knows who he is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I was wondering, if you were wondering too, if anybody has any questions, if we wanted to just sort of throw it out there and see what you say. Carlotta.
First of all, the way you express, you can tell you're very passionate, and you do it so beautifully. So thank you.
Thank you.
And I remember when I was reading the book, it was really interesting how, because so many musicians were, especially at that time, were high when they were being creative, and I know that they were fearful when they became sober that they wouldn't have that creativity anymore. But when you were interviewing them, you found the complete opposite. They're like, oh, I'm even more creative now. I'm even more in tune with what I want to write.
Exactly,
Right? So
exactly.
talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so had people like Bonnie Raitt, who'd recently given up drinking and using, and she was very fearful that she just wouldn't know how to write again. But that was just before her album, Nick of Time, that was huge. That's what really just put her back on the map. And David Crosby was the same. I remember being on a plane, and he was on the plane, and he put out his pipe, and he was about to sort of get high, and they nearly kicked him off the flight. And he said that was also his fear. And he was, unfortunately, he recently passed, but, he talked about the wonderfulness of being sober and having the straight mind. And Joni Mitchell said all these different ways one uses, artists over the years who have used the lexias and things, but the long-distance runner of them all is the sober mind. So I was very, very fortunate. So, a lot of the people that were real imbibers were able to talk about it objectively and say, say for Bonnie, for instance, she said, when you come off the stage and you've all got so high because you've all kind of clicked into this zone, and the audience as well, it's such a high that you can't just come off stage and go to bed. It's like there's no way. You want to keep it going. And that was a lot of the reasons why they started drinking originally. Thanks, Carlotta. Luce.
I have a question about drive. I know it's probably different for each person, but where do you think it comes from, and what inspires that drive to be on a consistent level?
It's interesting because I asked them, where does the drive come from? Where do you think? And the sort of general answer was, for some people, like, say, Graham Nash, he said, I knew this was part of my destiny and I was going to be famous. He just knew it from a very young age. He knew he had something that was going to be big. And other people would say, when the drive for them was to originally, when they were young, the guys, they said because they knew that if you're a musician, you can pull girls much easier. And then, of course, when they actually started, they knew that the drive was that when they are doing something that they're so passionate about, that they feel whole, they feel more of who they are. And that was their drive then, to keep going. I'm trying to think if there are any other... It was something that, even if they'd started at a young age, they knew it clicked into something, and they just had to keep on doing it.
What if you feel like full off? What if you you lack the confidence and the belief that you can do it.
Yeah, but I think that's rather like Chris's quote, you just have to feel what is it that really turns you on, that really lights your fire. And once you know what that is, you go with that rather than trying to be something that you're actually not. I think it's that connecting to that part of yourself that you gets very important to you and lights your fire.
You think the same thing? Is there a commonality between people who are musically creative and, say, artists, painters, writers, that sort of thing?
No, but that's what's so interesting about Joni Mitchell's interview, because she originally thought she was going to be an artist, a painter, because that's what they did in Canada, where she lived, where she grew up. They were the it was the painters.
Yeah.
But for her, she could still do her painting, but music became part of what she loved. But her parents were not pleased about that. They wanted her to be the painter of the town. It was a small town. But just talking about that thing I was talking about earlier, this sort of peak experience, when I asked her about that, she said when she's painting, it's like she goes into a zone. And she kind of hears almost like the words that says red in the right-hand corner, or blue over on the left, and it's almost as if something takes over, just like when the musicians talk about when words come out of nowhere, or whether they're sleeping and they suddenly wake up and they've got lyrics that they were looking for in their head, and they have to write them down, because if they don't, they'll forget them by the morning. And a lot of, I can't remember, I think it was Anthony Kiedis, who said that he started waking up like every 10 minutes because another lyric would come, and so he'd have to wake up again and write it down. And I think it was Ronnie Wood who actually said one time he couldn't be bothered, and he knew it was a rift, it was something that he heard it in his kind of half sleep, and he didn't, and then he forgot it, but then sometime later he heard it. Someone else had used it, It's almost as if the whole thing is there, all up there, and you've just got to bring it down.
I was talking with somebody the other day about a couple examples, but with the best one is George Harrison and My Sweet Lord / He's So Fine.
Yeah.
And there's no way in hell George Harrison didn't know She's So Fine. On the other hand, I maintain, perhaps it was just in the back of his mind somewhere, and he came up with this lovely melody in his mind and didn't realize, as you were saying, that somebody else had done it, 15 years earlier.
Exactly. I just thought, this is nice, this seems to work. And then, yeah, I think you're right. Just sort of stayed there in his kind of unconscious.
Yeah, I mean, he wound up losing the lawsuit on the thing, but
it was sad, especially as about My Sweet Lord.
I mean, he did lots of other people's songs. He didn't need to steal anything.
Yeah.
And it didn't seem to be in his
makeup,
exactly.
Yeah.
Where in your lifetime have you felt the most creative, and did you follow it, or did it kind of get smothered kind of thing? Was it encouraged to come out? Or?
Yeah, it wasn't encouraged when I was a child, because I remember doing, excuse me, I remember doing a drawing I was really proud of, or a painting, and I remember showing it to my mum, and I must have been about, 9 or 10 or something, and I showed it to her, but, the next door neighbour happened to be in the kitchen as well, so I showed it to them both, and my mother afterwards took me aside and said, "Stop blowing your own trumpet." So it's like a real smothering thing. But it was fine if I did well at school and came back home with a gold star. but it was like anything that was creative was sort of frowned upon. But I think, although I wrote poems, and I had to, because there was some, I found it easier to write than speak when I was younger, because I think I was pretty sort of locked inside. And that was my way of sort of coming out. And I think that what was so amazing for me was when I actually got started with the idea of interviewing the musicians about creativity and listening to every single one of them and asking whatever I wanted to. That's what got me feeling more creative, that I'd actually put this together myself, that I'd found the musicians and I'd interviewed them and I'd transcribed it and I watched and I looked and saw the things that they said about creativity. And I also got that feeling that, which I said earlier, was it was just happening like magic. And that's what they often talked about what creativity is about. So I think that's when I realized, actually, I think I am creative. I think I'm doing the thing that I really like. But I also think it doesn't have to be just one thing, because I spent about 20 years in the addiction field getting people into treatment when I was in England, getting them into treatment in Tucson, and getting therapists from that country into our country, and excuse me, water. And putting people together and finding therapists that would get on with other therapists and sort of organizing things. And I realized that was something that I did quite easily and did quite well, and is getting people together so that they can share what knowledge they had, and also organized workshops for people for different kinds of, either they were in recovery or they had problems with relationships, and I'd pick the therapists from America, because I knew that in America the therapists were much further advanced than they were in England. We were quite sort of behind. So I realized there was something else that I could do quite naturally, and I never realized it until I started doing it.
So that would be your gift of being the connector.
Mm-hmm.
What about your singing?
Right, next.
I've got
Bernie in the back.
Bernie in the back.
Bernie right here.
Bernie right there.
Again.
Hi.
Hey, I'm just wondering, like, listening to you, like, after you interviewed all of those people, and separately from the fame of whoever it is, was there anybody that was, like, particularly really deep and mysteriously mystical or something about their creativity that struck you? You know, like, sometimes you can meet somebody and they've got a different kind of energy about them and if they happen to be a creative person, like, usually it's a sign that something really deep and connected to spirit or something going on.
Yeah, well, the extraordinary thing is because one of the questions was about spirituality, so they had to go there. Mm-hmm. And what I used to think of musicians, because, having been married to Mick and then to Ian Wallace, so I was around musicians a lot, but was quite shy and used to think, because I would drink, and I felt musicians represented sort of like drinking, and I didn't see, and also like amazing songwriters. But when I started interviewing, because of asking that question about the spirituality, I realized they all have this extraordinary humility about them. Even though you see them and they're prancing on stage or doing whatever they had, every single one of them had this humility, because they felt a lot of the time it wasn't them. It's like they were given the lyrics or the whatever it was. It's like they were kind of connected to a sort of higher, maybe a deeper part of themselves or a higher power, however you want to look at it. So it was really enlightening from the first musician onwards of interviewing them. But what was interesting too was that the blues musicians, when I asked about spirituality, it was sort of taken in a different context, because they often had, they'd go to the spiritual churches, and so it was sort of, I think it was their answers were slightly different to those that weren't the blues musicians.
Formal religion was
More about religion, exactly. Yeah.
Is there anything that surprised you going in writing this that you thought you knew and then after?
Yeah, well, I think it was the thing about peak experience. Because I had no idea that they all experienced it. And Eric, on the first book, he wrote, with something that he said, he thought he was the only one because nobody talked about it. And that surprised me, actually asking that question. It was quite daring because they might say, I don't want to talk about that, in case it sort of meant that the inspiration won't visit them again. But they were all so honest about it and described it. That's what surprised me. Anyone else?
The question.
Yeah.
Peter Green, were you around him? Did you see the change develop in the script, or was it like an overnight thing?
Yeah, it was so sad. I knew him when he first met Mick. So he was just this young lad from the East End with short hair and the mutton chop sideboards. And he was funny and he was wonderful, but he was already a really good guitarist. And then obviously he sort of was the initiator of Fleetwood Mac. And I think what happened, this is my feeling, is that they had their first American tour, and that was very exciting. But not long after that, I think it was that first tour or the second tour, these girls asked him to come to Germany. I think he'd met them in the States, and they gave him a lot of acid. And I think my belief is if you're somebody who's so sensitive and just such an incredible, like a finely tuned instrument, and you start having acid, that is just going to blow your mind, It's a trigger.
What happened to my brother?
Really?
Yeah, my brother, one hit of acid,
That was it.
schizophrenia.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah.
They say it's all cool and everything, but there are people that,
They're too
have more
sensitive.
damage.
Yeah. And it's not like he changed immediately. I remember when Mick and I, we'd be together and then we'd separate, then we'd be together again, and we'd be together. And he contacted me. We were living in a flat in Notting Hill Gate. And he said, I'm on my way to see my manager. Because usually the boys in the band wouldn't talk to the girlfriends of their fellow bandmates. There was a kind of unspoken rule. But Peter contacted me, he said, I'm outside in a cab. Could you come down with me? Because I have some questions to ask you. And so I went down, sat in the cab, and he was on his way to the manager, wherever, not too far away. And he said, I feel there's something changing inside me. And I want to ask you about your spiritual awakening or what it was like in India. I want you to tell me what you know, what did you learn from meditating. And I had not very long to try and answer that enormous question, but it wasn't long enough. It was almost just not even getting into the tip of the iceberg. And he never mentioned it again. But not long after that, his girlfriend, who's one of my dear friends, he wanted her to make robes for him. So he'd go on stage and he'd have these robes like Jesus. And so you just knew something was changing. And we were on one American tour, and he came into our room, to one of the Holiday Inns, and he said, look, I think we shouldn't just keep touring for money. I think we should give all our money away, and I think we should just tour for the love of it.
I read the book.
You read the book, yeah. And I thought that was a wonderful idea, but Mick, who's much more practical, said, I don't think so, And then after Pete had gone out, we went into the manager's room, And he had like an ice pack on his head because he was obviously like, oh God. And that was,
Was he functional after that?
what?
How long was he functional after that?
Not long. He left really after that because he felt, his ideal was not being acknowledged. And his ideal was not to play for money.
And you know what he didn't play much for many years.
No, he became a grave digger. And he grew his nails very long, so he couldn't play guitar.
But he eventually.
And then
played again.
he played again. But it was never like it was. But have you got this book? You've got it, haven't you? Yeah. I don't know, have you read the Peter Green interview yet?
I did.
You did?
I don't remember all of it.
Right, yeah. Yeah, so at least we've got some, bits from him. And one of them is, he says, it feels so different to him if he plays to an audience that nobody has paid any money. He doesn't then feel he's got a responsibility. He can just play.
He must have been also seeing, hearing, and
Voices?
things of schizophrenia.
Yeah, I once, I think I was living in LA and I went to visit him. He was in Richmond or somewhere like that, in this little place. And I saw him, and he was very open. He was sort of a bit like the old Peter. And we started talking about his medication. He said, I've stopped taking my medication, and I'm feeling a lot better, but I only sometimes hear voices. Then he wanted to show me something, so we went upstairs, and there was this big trunk, and he opened up the lid, and it was filled with knives. And I thought, oh, please God, he doesn't hear voices right now. So that was scary, and I realized that was probably not a very sensible thing to do. If someone that you thought was so wonderful and had such, nice rapport with, no, when they're ill, they're sick, they're not the same person.
And typically the medication helps.
Yeah. So. Well, we have some, if anybody wants to buy a copy, but we've also got some of the Jennifer Juniper books, which is a memoir, and we've got the hardback, which you can't get anymore. And if anybody would like to buy one of those, we've got them out front, I think.
Yes.
Bernie? Yeah.
Yes.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you for coming. And thank you.
Thank you.